to another of our devotional studies in the book of Job as we continue exploring the question of suffering. I'm Pastor Greg Bing of Grace Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Glad that you have decided to join us for this study from God's Word. In Job chapter 15, we saw the start of the second round of counsel, advice that's given by Job's three friends to him in dealing with his sufferings. We saw that it began with Eliphaz, the Temanite, and we looked at the fact that Eliphaz reasoned with Job based on his experience, on what I have seen, as he put it. His first speech, Eliphaz was somewhat gentle with Job and somewhat compassionate with him, even hesitant to criticize him at all, but he went ahead and spoke anyway. And the second speech we saw in chapter 15, he was very angry and hurt, and his words were very, very highly critical of Job. In our last study, in Job chapter 16, we saw Job begin his response to Eliphaz and the criticism that he gave, and you can hear the exasperation in his voice that his friends have come and they've provided no comfort and help to him at all. He tells Eliphaz, he says, I've heard all of this before. You're not adding anything to the discussion. And he tells them, you're all miserable comforters. He got no comfort or help from them at all. Job feels that his sufferings are an expression of God's hostility toward him. And he says this anger and this hostility from God has actually worn him out. He's exhausted. He still maintains his righteousness. He doesn't believe that he's done any wickedness that's worthy of this suffering that he's going through. And so he looks to heaven and he says, my evidence, the proof of my innocence is going to be found in heaven. But not having received any answer from God, Job is resigned to the fact that he says, my life is just about finished. And he knows that the only thing that awaits him is death. As he continues in Job chapter 17, notice what he says in the first verse. He says, my spirit is broken. My days are extinguished. The grave is ready for me. In the Hebrew, it's actually three sets of two-word pairs. The spirit of Job was broken. His days were extinguished. And the only thing remained for him was the grave. Not only had God's silence discouraged Job, but he had also had to go through the words of his friends, the criticism of his friends, and that had simply added fuel to the fire. And so we see in verse 2, he says, Are not mockers with me? And does not my eye dwell on their provocation? He says, my friends mock me. They provoke me to my face. In verse 3, he asks God, he says, put down a pledge for me with yourself. Who is he who will shake hands with me? For you have hidden their heart from understanding. Therefore, you will not exalt them. What Job is saying is he's asking God to pledge his support for Job in defending himself against his friends. He points out the fact that these men have no understanding. It's been hidden from them. He says, therefore, there's no honor that's due to them. They shouldn't be exalted. And so he's wanting to God to pledge his support to stand with him against them. But instead of receiving this pledge from God to defend him against his friends, it says in verse 6, Job says, but he has made me a byword of the people, and I have become one in whose face men spit. He said, God's made me a byword. The word means I'm a joke to people. He says, they hold me in such contempt that they don't hesitate to spit in my face. Now, why would people do that to a man who had a reputation for uprightness, righteousness, fear of God? Why would they do that? I think they think the same thing his friends did. I think it was a commonly accepted belief that sufferings came from God as a judgment for sin. Therefore, they believe too that Job must be guilty of some type of sin or wickedness. Job's miserable physical condition is further evidence. Look at verse 7. He says, my eye has also grown dim because of sorrow, and all my members are like shadows. You could see in Job's physical condition, in his eyes, he says they've grown dim with sorrow, from weeping, from exhaustion. No doubt his eyes were red. There must have been circles around his eyes, darkness. His body parts, his skin and bones. He was very lean, very skinny. The skin looked terrible with the boils all over them. It showed that this was the shadows of death. And so Job says in verse 8, very sarcastically, I believe, he says, upright men are astonished at this, and the innocent stirs himself up against the hypocrite. Now, I think he's referring to his friends. He calls them the upright because they believed that they were upright, because they hadn't experienced these sufferings. He says, they're astonished at me. He says, the innocent, those who consider themselves innocent, They stir themselves up against me because they believe that I'm a hypocrite, because he maintained his innocence. They believed he had to be wicked. And yet in verse 9 he says this, yet the righteous will hold to his way, and he who has clean hands will be stronger and stronger. Job maintained, I am righteous. I am innocent of anything that would bring about this type of sufferings into my life. And he says, I'm going to hold to that. I'm going to hold to that firmly. I have clean hands. The one who has clean hands is really going to grow stronger and stronger. And he believed that he would one day be vindicated by God if he would simply speak. In verses 10 through 16, Job belittles the supposed wise counsel that these friends had given him. Again, verse 10, we can hear the sarcasm in Job's voice as he said, but please, he says, come back again, all of you, for I shall not find one wise man among you. The NIV describes it and says, all of you, come back, try again. Bring your wise counsel to me. Come back and try to teach and advise me. Now, what Job truly wishes, I'm sure, is that they would go away, or certainly that they would at least be silent. But he says, there's not a wise one among them. They won't be silent. And Job chapter 13, verse 5, he had earlier told them, oh, that you would be silent. He said, that would be your wisdom. Your silence would be the wisest thing you could do. But he knows they're not going to do this. They will be back, and he'll have to suffer through their words again. In verse 11, Job evaluates his situation. Again, there are three sets of two-word phrases, just like we saw in verse 1. He says in verse 11, he says, my days are past. My purposes are broken off, even the thoughts of my heart. Job's days were just about over. He says, my purposes, my plans, my dreams, my hopes for myself and for my family. He says, those things are now broken off. They're finished. Even the thoughts of my heart are broken off as well. Verse 12 is kind of a difficult verse to be sure of its meaning. When it says there in verse 12, it begins, they change the night into day. The light is near, they say, in the face of darkness. I believe this is probably a reference to the three friends. They change the night into day. They say the light is near, even in the face of darkness. I think this is something similar to what we see said by Zophar in Job chapter 11, verses 13 through 20. He told Job, if you would just prepare your heart, if you would stretch out your hand to God, if you would put iniquity far away from you, if you would acknowledge your sin and wickedness and turn back to God, he says, then you would forget your misery, all the darkness that you're going through, and your life would be brighter than noonday. That's what they told him, but this wasn't the case for Job. Job had lost his household, he had lost his family, he had lost his possessions, he'd lost his health. He looks at death, he looks at the grave. That's his only family. That's his only comfort. And that's what he says in verse 13. He says, if I wait for the grave as my house, if I make my bed in the darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, you are my mother and sister. He says, where then is my hope? And as for my hope, who can see it? You see, he says, if these things are true, if I'm right that the only family I have is death, the only comfort I have is death, he says, then where's my hope? He says, who's going to see it? Who can even see it or imagine that I have any hope? Because that's how he's feeling right now. He's feeling absolutely hopeless. And in verse 16, he laments this very thing in the form of questions. He says, will they go down to the gates of Sheol? Shall we have rest together in the dust? I think what he's saying is that his hope, that his comfort, that his purposes, that is the thoughts and intents of his heart, he says, those are all going to go down with me to the gates of Sheol, which is the abode of the dead. He said, they shall all rest together with me in the dust. And again, a reference to dust. We're born and made from the dust, and we're going to go back to the dust of the ground. He says, all my hopes, all my comfort, it's all going to go with me to the grave. When you hear those words and you hear the despair in Job's expression of these thoughts, it clearly shows, I think, that his three friends are indeed what he called them. They're miserable comforters. They are worthless physicians and have provided no healing for his hurting soul. You know, just seeing Job's horrible physical appearance and knowing his painful losses, hearing the hopelessness in his voice and his words, you would think that if his friends had any real wisdom or prudence from God, if they had any genuine compassion for this one that they called a friend, that they would cease their critical and hurtful accusations against Job. but something keeps them coming back to pour out more and more bitterness and cruelty in their words to Job. I think, number one, they feel hurt. I think they feel insulted that Job doesn't agree with them about their philosophy that suffering is God's judgment on the wicked. Job maintains that he's righteous, and he dares to question that they have any wisdom or understanding at all. I think their pride, as aged, as experienced, as well-educated men, leads them to lash out at him in this way, to defend themselves, to defend their honor as they believe it. I also think it's possible there's another reason as well. The whole situation, I think, may make them afraid. If Job is right, that not only do the wicked suffer, but the righteous can suffer as well, even miserably, like Job has suffered. If that's true, then that puts them in danger of suffering the same fate that Job has suffered. I think that frightens them. And I think when they compare themselves to Job and say, if it can happen to Job, an upright, a blameless, a God-fearing man who shunned evil, if it can happen to him, it can certainly happen to us. And it makes them afraid. In our next lesson, we're going to look at the second speech of a man named Bildad, the Shuhite. He strikes out against Job even more viciously than he did the first time. I hope that you'll join us as we continue these studies in the book of Job.